Iran had sort of tried to show a bit of strength, but in a sense, it was a show that they have to try to hold back themselves from direct confrontation with Israel because they know they're outgunned. They have serious economic issues. They have serious social issues.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. A year after the tragic events of October 7, 2023, the war in Gaza rages on. New fronts have emerged in Syria, Yemen, and southern Lebanon, while Israel finds itself in a long-range shooting war with Iran. Today we're joined by returning guest from Ireland, Emeritus Professor Scott Lucas, to break down these ongoing crises and what they mean for the future of the region. Is this the beginning of World War III? Join us as we dissect what Netanyahu's campaigns are doing to change the landscape of the Middle East right here on The Focus. Scott, welcome to The Focus.
All right, thank you so much, John. It's always great to be here with you and your listeners.
Thank you. Scott, I'm going to start off with a relatively tough question. With Israel and Iran now engaging in direct long-range strikes, are they now openly at war? And if that's the case, what are the strategic implications for both countries?
I think we need to go step by step, John, on this. Let's take your immediate question, which is, do the twin strikes that Iran carried out against Israel, there was a set in April with about 320 missiles and drones. And then in early October, we're talking about 181 missiles. And then the possibility of Israeli retaliation. Does that mean that direct war that goes across the region and pulls everybody in? And I would say no. But I think we need to do that both to get wider context and then to get to where the real action is and where the real serious issue is, primarily for civilians. In both cases, when Iran threw those missiles at Israel, they were sort of demonstration attacks. Now, I don't want to downplay the fact that when a missile comes and you're having to shelter in a bunker, you're having to hide, that's a serious thing. But in both cases, the Iranians had flagged that the attacks were coming. Back in April, the proximate cause for that is that Israel has been bumping off Iranian commanders. They were especially doing so in Syria, including one attack near the Iranian embassy. And the Iranian regime just had to simply make a show of strength, stop killing our guys. That didn't stop the Israelis. The Israelis stopped assassinating Iranian commanders in Syria. But of course, what they then did is that they assassinated others. They assassinated Hamas and Hezbollah leaders. Yep. One of the leaders that they assassinated was Hamas's political leader, a man named Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. He was there for the inauguration of the Iranian president at the end of July. And the Israelis probably used an agent to get him with an explosive. And then, of course, the Israelis subsequently in September, they killed the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. So once again, the Iranians are in the position of both to their own people and across the region, do they look weak? So they throw those missiles across with a bit of chest thumping. The missiles in that October attack did cause damage to one military base, the Nevatim Air Base. But that air base is in a sparsely populated area of Israel. It's in the Negev Desert. And again, not wanting to downplay the damage that caused, but across Israel, there were 2 injuries. That's just 2 injuries from all those missiles, because people had gone to the shelters and because most of the Iranian missiles that would have been heading for populated areas were intercepted because the Israelis knew they were coming. Iran had sort of tried to show a bit of strength, but in a sense, it was a show that they have to try to hold back themselves from direct confrontation with Israel because they know they're outgunned. They have serious economic issues. They have serious social issues. Now, Israel, for its part, under Benjamin Netanyahu, the reason why I say they will not retaliate, I think, in a way which means a direct confrontation, there will still be an Israeli demonstration strike against Iranian military bases. But if you look at what's happened in the week since then, what Benjamin Netanyahu has done is he's pressed ahead with the assaults in Gaza, now almost 13 months old, and in Lebanon. And that's Netanyahu's focus. That's the Israeli military's focus. Why is that? Netanyahu was in serious trouble if we go back to September. And that's because that war in Gaza had no end point, it had no end game. The Israeli people were calling for a return of the hostages, about 100 of whom, dead or alive, are still held by Hamas. Equally important, the Israeli military were privately criticizing Netanyahu. The defense minister, Yoav Gallant, was saying, look, we can't destroy Hamas. So what does Netanyahu do? What do the Israelis do? They launched the Patriot attacks in Lebanon. 24 hours after Netanyahu publicly threatened to fire Gallant, the Patriot attacks happen in Lebanon. That reconciles him and the military. The walkie-talkie attacks follow. The assassination of Nasrallah follows. And now, of course, the ground operations, cross-border invasion, and the airstrikes. That's where we are with Lebanon, on top of the fact that the war is actually expanding in Gaza. The Israelis, day before yesterday, killed almost 80 people in one airstrike alone. And that's why I say I don't want to downplay Israel and Iran. You know, there's always been that tension between them since the formation of the Islamic Republic in '79. It would be serious if they went into direct war with each other, but I think the priority of Netanyahu right now is Gaza and Lebanon, and that's where our attention should be.
All right, but Scott, you know, from a strategic perspective, both Hamas and Hezbollah have long been spoken of as proxy forces for the Iranians. If both Hezbollah and Hamas get militarily eroded to the point where they simply can't put up any fight whatsoever, that's not going to be in Iran's interest, because it certainly reduces Iran's strategic footprint in the Middle East. So knowing this, and knowing that basically Hezbollah and Hamas are kind of on their own, except for the occasional missile strike, you know, you wouldn't want to be a Hamas or a Hezbollah commander, would you?
With the pride, I tend to call Hamas and Hezbollah allies rather than proxies, because while there is cooperation and even coordination with Iran, you know, these are autonomous groups. Hezbollah has its interest in Lebanon, Hamas, of course, in Palestine. But I do take your point that these organizations are seriously degraded. I think if you get back to Iran, you're sort of saying, well, is the regime like thinking, well, we don't want these forces to disappear, therefore we're forced to go after Israel directly? And again, I think, you know, if the regime was in a stronger position, both internally, in terms of its economic position and social position, and if they were in a stronger position militarily, I think, yeah, that's an option. But I think at this point, in terms of a direct confrontation, Iran does not come out well. What you would look more, what we might call asymmetric operations. I mean, the Houthis in Yemen, for example, who again are allied with Iran, they could lob missiles at Israel. In fact, they have lobbed missiles at Israel to so far very limited effect. Iranian-led militias in Iraq and in Syria could fire on U.S. personnel. But even those, as it were, indirect options come with great risk. I mean, the Americans have fired back on those militias and have pretty much deterred those attacks since January of this year. The Houthis, if they push too far, would risk, in fact, there have been U.S. and British airstrikes on them. I think the Iranian regime's play here is political, and the political leaders look, we're the victims here. We're the victims, as well as Hamas being the victims, Hezbollah being the victims. We need the world to call out Israel. We need the world to take action against Israel, because it would help break the Iranian regime's isolation. Remember, they're still under international sanctions over their nuclear program and other activities. So I think they go political. If it shifts, if Iran all of a sudden fronts up to Israel, I'll call it out as soon as it happens. But I think the second level I would go to is this: why Iran doesn't directly go after Israel is that Hamas and Hezbollah don't disappear. And this is the problem with Netanyahu's open-ended war. If you were talking about one where the goal was strategic rather than a personal goal, and I'll talk about Netanyahu's personal goal if you wish, but strategically, Hamas has been decimated at the top. It's lost its political leader, Ismail Haniyeh. It's lost the planner of the October 7th attacks, Mohammed Deif. And now it's lost the military leader, Yahya Sinwar. But there will be others to replace them. We'll see who Sinwar's replacement will be, whether it's maybe Khaled Mashal, who's been prominent since the 90s, or whether it's Sinwar's brother, for example, Mohammed Sinwar. That's just a couple of the options. But the issue here is that while Hamas cannot, as it were, fight back against Israel, you're not going to see a repeat of October the 7th inside Israel. They'll continue to try to survive on the ground in Gaza. Now, I think Netanyahu's play will be to go to the international community and say, okay, we're willing to cease fire if Hamas is expelled from Gaza. But that's a big ask. I mean, that's equivalent to when the PLO were expelled from Palestine, which didn't end Palestinian resistance. Same thing with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is, and we can certainly, you can challenge Hezbollah's operations. You can challenge what it's done vis-a-vis Israel, but Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese system. I mean, it's been part of the government. It's part of the economic system. It's part of the social system. It's got a lot of support in Lebanon. Nasrallah is dead. Other Hezbollah leaders are dead, but Hezbollah will not be eradicated unless you completely collapse Lebanon and get back to a repetition of the civil war between 75 and 90. And I wouldn't put that out of the reach of what Netanyahu wants. I think he's willing to sacrifice Lebanon. But short of completely collapsing Lebanon, I think Hezbollah remains, and you do have to deal with it at some point rather than trying to militarily destroy it.
I mean, what you're saying makes perfect sense. And it makes perfect sense to people who have experience in the Middle East, because everything that we see in the headlines, they're just screaming nonsense, quite frankly. And they're being used as propaganda points for one side and the other, confusing pretty much everyone else that is even mildly curious about the truth and what's going on in that part of the world. But, you've got Iran and its axis of resistance, partners, allies, whatever you want to call them. And we can talk about likely motives for them to continue resisting Israeli aggression, if you will. But it's really all about Israel. It's all about Netanyahu in particular. And, you talk about almost a rational settlement at some point once the Israelis, or once Netanyahu feels that he's got such an upper hand that he can afford to, put up his feet and relax. Do you think we're getting close to that now? Or do you think that, as you rightly pointed out earlier, we make such a big deal in the West that the Israelis are conducting these decapitation strikes, they're killing this, they're knocking off commanders left, right, and center. I mean, it shows some form of military weakness, to be sure. The Israeli intelligence has penetrated both Hezbollah, Hamas, and even Iran. That's not a position of strength, to be sure. But in the end, Scott, I mean, I just don't know whether or not Netanyahu is going to be happy to put up his spurs in the near future, because if he senses blood in the water, isn't it more likely that he's just going to continue pushing when he has the advantage?
Well, here's where I'm fully in agreement with you, that we are talking about an open-ended wars, both in Gaza and Lebanon. And I'm fully in accord with you that the person who has the power to end those open-ended wars, first and foremost, is Benjamin Netanyahu. Right. But that's when you get to a question of motive. And I think the issue here, I referred to it earlier, is you get back to the personal motive here. Netanyahu doesn't necessarily want to end the wars, even to claim victory at this point, because just before October 7th, of 2023, Netanyahu was in serious trouble in Israel. Hamas, in effect, saved him. So just a quick reminder here, Benjamin Netanyahu was part of a coalition government, which was trying to maintain power, maintain authority. He was facing, of course, opposition parties, but he was also facing very serious legal issues. Since 2019, Benjamin Netanyahu has faced bribery and fraud charges, and he spent years trying to evade having to show up in court for the trial. And what he had done in 2023, again, just to remind your listeners, because I think it's essential background, is he tried to break the Israeli judicial system, or to be more precise, to make it bend the knee to the executive, that the executive will have veto authority over the judiciary, which meant it would have veto authority over any proceeding against Netanyahu. Now, he had split Israeli society by doing that. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that were protesting. We're talking about reservists saying they wouldn't carry out military service. His own attorney general had come out against him, as well as judges coming out against him. Then Hamas saves him. But it puts Netanyahu in this position, which is, if he ends this war without the return of the Israeli hostages, and for those people who know Israel, that question of getting back hostages, whether they're dead or alive, is fundamental to Israeli political culture. Absolutely fundamental. If Netanyahu does not get those folks back, he still will be under pressure if he stops military operations.
Yep.
Again, a quick reminder, if you go back just before the attacks on Lebanon, there were hundreds of thousands of people coming out in Israel on the weekends, including in front of Netanyahu's home, as well as on the streets of Tel Aviv and other cities, saying, you have to make the hostages the priority rather than destroying Hamas. Well, Netanyahu couldn't get those hostages back because he won't agree to a ceasefire. So that's why he carries out the Lebanese operation. We are still in that position.
Yep.
If the hostages were back, Netanyahu would probably declare mission accomplished, but they're not. So what does that mean if you were to game it out? I mean, Hamas is not going to give up those hostages without something in return still, even if they're in a weakened position. That something in return probably would be their continued presence in Gaza. Israel or Netanyahu is not going to agree to that. He's not going to agree to Hamas staying in Gaza. So you get into a dead end in terms of the talks. So the war becomes open-ended. And it just goes on and on and on for the sake of Netanyahu's personal political survival. Now the Israeli military. Yeah.
So sorry, Scott. I'm reminded by the fact that when we spoke last in February, you did say that Netanyahu, if he stops fighting in Gaza, and at that time everything was contained to Gaza and the horrors that were happening in that little strip of territory, he will be brought before the courts and he will be probably, jailed for his crimes and misdemeanors. But now, many Israelis, as far as I understand, are backing Netanyahu's wars. They're all happening all over the place. He's done the whole daring do quite nicely. It appeals to many young Israelis in particular. Many of them are, very vengeful about what happened on October 7th, and they buy into the propaganda that's being fed to them in terms of what had happened at that time and the exaggerated claims that were made at that time. So I don't know. It's a difficult thing to sort of pull apart here, because if Netanyahu is as Machiavellian as we think that he is, and I don't doubt that he is he then fully exploiting the opportunities that are presented to him by the reactions of Iran, of Hezbollah, of Hamas? No matter what they do, he can keep on shuffling the deck chairs of the Titanic, but he, as the Titanic, will never sink. He's just going to be a floater of Israeli politics. He'll always be the perpetual prime minister and the perpetual war hero. I mean, I don't know. It's a pretty nasty kind of thing to think of.
Well, except there's one element there that you have to factor into that. And first, you're absolutely right. Netanyahu is a supreme political opportunist, and he has indeed exploited the fact that Hamas made, I think, a huge error in thinking that they could carry out October 7th and that this would bolster them. And then Hezbollah, which in fact has been limited in its response to the Israelis, they were going to get it in the neck if Netanyahu needed to do so. But what's left out of this is that it is one thing to carry out airstrikes and perpetual airstrikes. It's another thing to carry out ground assaults that don't have an endpoint, because you can get bogged down in them. And the Israeli experience, particularly in Lebanon, has not been good. They went in 82. This is pre-Hezbollah, but they went in 78 and 82, intervening in the Lebanese civil war. They went to try to expel the PLO from Beirut. Okay, fine. They expelled the PLO from Beirut, but then their forces effectively got trapped in Lebanon. And they suffered severe political and military damage from that intervention. There were other issues while Israel carried on an occupation of southern Lebanon in the 90s, such as the 1996 human rights abuses, the massacre that took place in Ghana by the Israelis, that dented their position. But then in 2006, they had ended the occupation and they went back into Lebanon. There was another scrap with Hezbollah. Hezbollah gave them a bloody nose, right? And the problem here is that Netanyahu can play the open-ended wars, but at some point you have to say, where's the political basically setup that you're going to put in Gaza and in Lebanon for this? Are you going to bring in another Palestinian group like the Palestinian Authority to take over Gaza? Are you going to keep pushing on the Arab states to send in peacekeeping forces, which I don't think they will do, and put them in there? And if you don't have those options, and I think Netanyahu's pointing towards this, do you occupy Gaza like you did the West Bank? Right? Well,
Right.
that doesn't provide for stability, right? And then again, is Israel going to occupy southern Lebanon? Because Hezbollah aren't going to disappear. And people tend to get tired of occupations. I'm, going to kick it back to May 2003. Saddam Hussein had fallen in Iraq. George Bush appears on the USS Abraham Lincoln off the coast of California with that banner mission accomplished behind him. Well, you know what happened in the years after that. So the issue here is that Netanyahu's mission is never accomplished. He's got to keep it going and going and going. And if it ever gets bogged down, then the problems resurface within Israel. And potentially, and I say this with huge caveats, as you know, potentially then you also have his problems resurrecting outside of Israel, in that if there's a different U.S. administration, the Harris administration I'm looking at, then you have the risk that maybe the U.S. takes the step of cutting or limiting military aid to Israel at some point down the line. And so what does Netanyahu do at that point? What does Netanyahu do if the EU puts enough pressure on Germany that Germany finally backs off a position which most people don't know, that it provides about a quarter of Israel's military assistance?
So was Iran ever the threat that Netanyahu and the Israeli right have portrayed it to be? Because as you rightly pointed out, the Israelis have been at it for many years. They would have known the skin and bones of Iran, the Quds Force, the IRCG, Hezbollah, and Hamas from root to branch. So was it ever the threat that the Israelis were portraying it to be?
Well, Iran was a rival. The Iranian regime's a rival. That's where you go, and both sides fight for influence. And so if you look at where the Israeli-Iran competition was going on, it would be in the midst of that Syrian, whether you call it a civil war, whether you call it the Assad regime's repression, the one that's killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, because of course the Iranians came in to support the Assad regime, to prop it up. So they've got a huge position in Syria. The Israelis don't want to see that. So they've been carrying out more than a decade of attacks inside Syria against Iran and Hezbollah. And they, that type of competition is going to continue throughout the Middle East, but it was going on at a level which was below the level of direct confrontation. So no, I think the Israeli military knew that the Iranian military's challenge is not direct, but of course, the challenge of Iran's allies does become a military challenge on October 7th, 2023. Because, when Hamas attacks, not because they were ordered to by Iran, because of their own calculations, but they are communicating with Iran. Whether or not Iran knew specifically about the attack, they're going to have to come behind it and support it. Then the stakes get raised, and then it, again, we go back to where we started, that, Israel's not necessarily looking at a direct war with Iran being the be all and end all for what has to take place, but they are looking at the fact, or at least elements in Israel are looking at the fact, that this time they have to knock out Hamas, they have to knock out Hezbollah, because that then puts Iran on the back foot for the indefinite future.
Okay, so Scott, the long-range shooting war Iran embarked upon against Israel in April and October of this year, while spectacular, allegedly did little damage to Israel, the country protected by its anti-ballistic missile systems, Iron Dome and Arrow. However, this being an asymmetric war, Iranian missiles are far cheaper than the ones used by Israel to shoot them down. Just on this fact alone, do you think Iran scored a success of sorts by running down Israel's stocks of expensive anti-ballistic missiles?
Yeah, that's the Iranian regime's line, which is, we didn't mean to kill civilians, we didn't mean to wipe them out, but look, we're exhausting them, where the next time we could hit them very much. And what I have to do is I say we're up in the air on that. I mean, first of all, let's talk about Iranian capabilities. They've thrown between the two attacks, they've thrown a couple of hundred of ballistic missiles over at Israel. They've thrown some cruise missiles across as well. All right, how many more of those ballistic missiles do they have if they're getting serious about trying to hit Israel? And then you talk about the Israeli systems in terms of the combination of Iron Dome, David Sling, the Arrow systems. How much of those have been degraded? How much would Israel have to spend to replenish it? Yeah. But here I think Iran comes a little bit of a cropper, and that is because, of course, Israel's not only going to have the internal resources to build those systems back up, they're going to get an awful lot of help from those who have other resources. So the Americans have already put in, what they call a terminal high altitude air defense system. That's right. That's right. And that was a symbolic move, but one which also had a very clear military point, which is, look, we can step up the protection here. And fact is, so Iran lobs a couple hundred more missiles across. Some of them may hit targets and so on. But again, even if the Iranians can degrade Israel's air defenses, the first time they hit a significant target that is in a populated area, they will get the wrath of Israel, and they will not knock out Israel's offensive capabilities. And it returns us to the start of our conversation, which is I can't give you a guarantee that the Iranian regime would not do that, in which case, we are in an open-ended war there. But I think if you were to game this out, Iran would need a lot more capabilities, not only in terms of denting Israel's defenses, but in terms of being prepared for a longer-term conflict, both in defending its own population against Israeli retaliation, and then in terms of the operations further against Israel. I mean, here's one fundamental point, which is Israel and Iran are several hundred miles apart. If Iran was to really take this to Israel, what could it do to hit Israel on the ground in terms of sustained operations? And the point here is that with Hamas and with Hezbollah seriously degraded, that limits that capability that you're talking about. And just put this in the mix, just to make sure this is different from the historical conflicts between Israel and the Arab countries. Before October 7th, we were talking about Israel normalizing relations. They had normalized relations with a couple of the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia was backing that effort. So the prospect of Israel-Saudi normalization would be there. The U.S., of course, was encouraging that. Now that has been put on hold because of October 7th and the aftermath of that. But the Arab states are not going to pile in to support Iran in a direct war against Israel. They're not going to. And so this is not the case, to use the line that Netanyahu still uses, that Israel is surrounded by enemies. It's not. And so, yeah, the Iran regime will bluster. It will say, we have shown the weakness of Israel. The axis of resistance should triumph. They're blowing smoke right now. And the question is, how long can they blow smoke to maintain their legitimacy, not primarily in the Middle East, but within their own country? Because if we were to have another podcast about Iran's internal situation, I'd start pointing to the fact that Iran's currency already at a historic low. As soon as the prospect of an Iran-Israel confrontation arose again in the last few weeks, it went down another 10%, right? And Iran does not have that many customers for its oil that it can offset the shock to its economy.
It'll have a Zimbabwe-style economy. If it already isn't there, it will get there. I know we're indulging in a bit of speculation here, Scott, but would the Iranian strikes against Israel have been more effective had they not given advanced warning to the Americans and to the Israelis? I mean, just for, as a surprise attack. You want to demonstrate some power? Don't tell anyone what you're doing. Hit the button and see what happens. I mean, I know it's a bit of a chaos theory approach to things, but the fact that they signaled intent allowed Israel and the United States to organize the Israeli air defense networks because of the signaling of Iran. Would we be talking about something far more catastrophic in terms of impact events on the ground in Israel?
Yes. And then Netanyahu would have the support from the Israeli military and other elements of the government to go after Iran with no holds barred. Right. And there's an important historical precedent to note on this. 2011, 2012, which was in a period when Iran's nuclear program was sanctioned, when Netanyahu was falsely saying that the Iranians had the bomb. It preceded the talks from 2013 that led to a nuclear agreement that stabilized the situation for a while. 2011, 2012, Netanyahu wanted to bomb Iran.
Yeah.
And it was the intelligence services and the military that held him back. You know, if Iran ever hit populated areas in Israel, if they ever hit a series of Israeli military positions, inflicting widespread casualties, nobody's going to hold Netanyahu back. And in fact, the military is going to join in the attack. They're not going to take that from the Iranians. So that's why Iran calibrated this. They calibrated it from they're trying to show strength from a position of weakness. Mm-hmm. And so to do that, you have to calibrate the attacks that took place to their own population. To some of them, they might have shown a bit of strength. People in the region pretty much know what the game is, but at least they buy themselves a bit of breathing space as the regime. Once you go all out with Israel, your breathing space is gone. You've got to be ready at that point. And again, I just that wider context. I don't support what Netanyahu has done with Hamas and Hezbollah because it's civilians who've paid the large toll. But it has weakened the ability of Iran to go into any type of conflict directly with Israel because it would have to have others in there with it. And it's simply not going to get them.
Well, speaking of that, what roles are Iran's allies such as Russia and China playing in this evolving conflict? Are we seeing signs of deeper international involvement?
The Chinese are just keeping their heads down. I mean, the Chinese tend to keep their heads down whenever you have the possibility of hot military confrontation because China's play is political and economic. They want to build up the strength of their system. They don't, military conflict tends to reduce their areas for opportunity. Nobody's going to be investing in the Middle East right now. At least in that area around Israel, Lebanon, and Palestine. At one point, so the Chinese might make murmurings at some point, this is terrible, especially what Israel's doing. But they'll say very little. The Russians will try to exploit the situation, but not directly. The Russians will try to exploit it in two ways. First is they do have a stake in the Middle East, but their position's in Syria. Yeah. They got that position in Syria, or they expanded it when they enabled the Assad regime to crush anti-Assad groups at the cost, again, of hundreds of thousands of lives. So they've got a military base there. They've got a naval base there. But they will want to be very careful that the Israelis don't hit them. And Israel has struck Assad regime targets near those bases. So they don't have a direct stake, as it were, right now, or not a high direct stake. Their primary stake here is to just portray themselves as the good guys, being willing to step in and broker a solution because they want to take the pressure off what they're doing in Ukraine. And of course, in another open-ended conflict, they are still bogged down in Ukraine 32 months into that invasion, with only a very gradual advance in the east. So Russia simply will play a little bit of propaganda points and political points, but they have done so. The biggest consequence for Russia is they've taken a huge gamble. And I'm not sure how many people have noticed this. Back in 2015, Putin made the play, which is we link up with Netanyahu. We link up with Netanyahu. We make an agreement on zones of influence in the Middle East, including over Syria. So Israel don't hit our interest in Syria. We don't hit the Israelis. We allow the Israelis to attack Assad regime targets and Iranian targets. That was the agreement back in 2015. That agreement has been undone. It's been undone because Russia has swung hard in supporting Iran and in supporting, quote, the Palestinian movement. They are highly critical of Israel. They've taken that gamble that somehow Israel will wind up losing this politically, and that they can get political capital off of it. But I think the problem here is that they're in an axis of the vulnerable alongside Iran, because neither country is in a very good economic shape at this point.
At the time of recording, we're still waiting for Israel's retaliation for Iran's October missile strike. Do you think that Netanyahu will go in hard in the hope of causing some sort of popular Iranian rebellion against the Ayatollah's leadership, or will cooler heads in Washington prevent this from happening? Now, I raise this because there's been a lot of speculation in the public domain with regard to what will Netanyahu do. We're all sort of sitting there with bated breath, waiting for his reaction. So I suspect you're going to say that it'll be a very measured response, keeping everything down to a dull roar. Yeah?
Yeah, it will. Now, to take on another dimension that you talked about here, the noise for regime change in Iran is not noise that comes from within Iran.
Yeah.
I need to emphasize this. And I've got a lot of friends in Iran.
Mm.
Those people, they don't like the system. They don't like repression. They don't like what the regime has done in pulling people down there, but they don't want this to be a regime change from the outside.
Yeah.
They want reform, right? The talk of regime change comes from from elements in the Iranian diaspora. It comes from the descendant of the late Shah, Reza Pahlavi, and it comes from hardliners in the U.S. and in Israel and in other countries. That's the guys who are talking about regime change. So, the idea that Netanyahu can carry out strikes and then you're going to have the uprisings on the streets to overthrow it is not going to happen. If anything, it either means that those people who want reform of the regime are actually in this position where they have to support the regime against those Israeli attacks, or they have to be very quiet.
Yeah.
Because of popular sentiment. So no, I think even if Netanyahu believed this, I think his military, his intelligence services, his diplomats know better. I still would play the idea that they as in April they sent a few missiles after at some Iranian missile sites or military sites. I think they would probably have a larger version of that, but I think it's been signaled in the press that they won't be going after the nuclear sites.
That's right.
Because of the sensitivity of that issue, and they won't be going after the oil installations because it could spike the oil price, which could have consequences for the U.S. election, or it could have consequences for Europe in terms of its stability. It could have consequences for Australia. Mm-hmm. So I think the reading here is it's the military sites that you're taking place, and then you have to say, well, which military sites do they hit to show strength, right? Mm-hmm. And to kind of hinder the Iranian military, but without risking this, the Iranian regime finally being cornered and then hitting back.
You know, what you're saying is quite amazing, because in the long term, it demands that all the players on the field, whether it's the United States, whether it's the Russians, whether it's the Israelis, whether it's the Iranians, they all have to act with an extreme amount of discipline, because one slip up on either one side or the other, which then gets misinterpreted or just blown out of proportion, can lead to something that could be a world-shaking event, don't you think? I mean, can we sustain this level of diplomatic discipline?
Oh man, I keep looking for a silver lining out of all of this, but now I've got to add another element, which is looming here, which is if Donald Trump gets elected in the United States. Now, I am absolutely no fan of the Biden administration's approach since October 7th. I think the Biden administration has not exercised the leverage, and it is the country that has the primary leverage to limit the mass killing in Gaza and in Lebanon. They continue to give Netanyahu the breathing space, not just for the mass killing, but for the humanitarian crisis that's being inflicted there. So I'm not a fan of that. But the fact is, I know what the Biden administration is doing. I can calculate what's doing, and so can the other players that take place. If you get Trump into office, and also some of the Trumpists, because you're talking about an administration here, who's going to be at State Department, who's going to be at Defense, you may have an unpredictable U.S. approach, which is does the U.S. go in and strike Iran? Now, we were on the point of the U.S. striking Iran at a couple of points during the Trump administration. He backed off. He bailed. But at one point, I think U.S. jets were close to being in the air to carry out bombing raids.
Yes, I do recall that. That's right.
Yeah. Do the Americans, in terms of backing Israel, not only provide them with the military aid to carry on operations, but does U.S. military units get involved? I don't think Trump would do that because he likes to make the idea there's no wars on his watch. But what takes place? Does Trump come in and add to further issues? Remember, as he did first term, backing the expansion of the West Bank, the illegal settlements in the West Bank. And remember, hundreds of people have been killed in the West Bank since last October 7th.
That's right.
That has been tense as well. So yeah, I can't give you a silver lining on that. What I can give you is this, that I think there's some movement, which is, look, we can't affect what's happening immediately, but we need to make preparations beyond it. And I would point people to those noises that are out there for a recognition of the Palestinian state. There have been several countries in Europe, including the one where I live now in Ireland, who have come out for recognition of a Palestinian state. They join most of the international community doing so. We'd have to see what Australia's position would be.
We'll be sitting on the fence. We always do.
Exactly. But always, people would say always in terms of other countries who now are like, the fence may be crumbling under you, because it's like you have to take a stand at some point. And I think that question of trying to say, how can we get a secure Palestine alongside a secure Israel? So if you can't affect the immediate situation, how do you begin the preparations for what comes next? That's what I would be pointing to.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, we go back to your question, which is, we hope that as sinister as some of these folks may be, as pernicious as some of them may be, that they still are rational, if pernicious, actors in terms of not taking that further step in escalating the violence.
Scott, what is the state of Lebanon in terms of its politics? How are the non-Hezbollah Lebanese authorities viewing Israel's actions on their sovereign land? And after the decapitation strike that took out Hezbollah's senior leadership, how prepared is Hezbollah for a prolonged conflict with Israel?
Let's take the Lebanon question, because I think it's one that a lot of people haven't really paid enough attention to, which is that, to start off with, you will have a lot of people in Lebanon who do not like Hezbollah. A lot of them simply hate Hezbollah, right? But they would probably hate Hezbollah in the sense of it's still an actor within the Lebanese system. And even if, of course, Hezbollah being Shia, even if you're Sunni or if you're Christian, it's like, do you really want to see the decimation of Hezbollah if it's going to take down your entire state? And that's what you're talking about here. Lebanon, again, got to keep it tight, but we'll do so. Remember, 15 years of civil war in which Hezbollah is created in the midst of that.
Yeah.
That rips the country apart with hundreds of thousands of casualties. Completely decimates what had been the financial center of the Middle East, and an economy which had done pretty well in the 50s and the 60s. All right, you come out of that in the 90s, you have to deal with Syrian occupation, which they finally get rid of the Syrian occupation after many, many years. You have to deal with Israeli occupation. You get rid of that after many, many years. They start to rebuild Beirut under a guy named Rafiq Hariri. Hariri's assassinated in 2005. So again, you go into instability, but everybody's still kind of holding it together. In 2019, the country almost collapses economically. There's a lot of corruption in Lebanon. The banking system, the financial system are not really fit for purpose. And in 2019, everything's about to collapse. And so the country has been, for months, going without garbage being collected, without basic services, and keeping the economy just hoping it will triple on. Now, I give you all of that background, which is, if you knock out Hezbollah or you cripple it, you have to expect that in doing so, you're going to bomb the hell out of Beirut, especially southern Beirut. You're going to bomb other areas of the country. You're going to add to displacement. And Lebanon already had more than 1 million Syrian refugees because of the Assad regime's repression there. So you're going to cause crisis throughout Lebanon. It won't be headlined as much as Gaza because the casualties are kind of more dispersed. So you may not get 44,000 casualties. You'll get thousands. But what you'll do is you'll be taking out a government and a system. You will be collapsing that. And then when you collapse it, Hezbollah might be decimated, but there will be other Shia groups that will be there. There'll be Sunni groups, there'll be Christian groups. You have the prospect of going back to 75 with people just simply trying to claim power in their local areas and other groups challenging them. That's what sharper folks will be looking at right now, because the Gulf states will not want that, even though they're being very quiet about it. The Iranians, of course, don't want that. The international community doesn't want that. But that's what Israel is risking. is to break that. That will probably be the salvation of Hezbollah in the end, is that, to destroy Hezbollah, Israel will have to destroy the entire country. And I think there may be lines which are drawn on Israel and Lebanon that have not been drawn in Gaza. The Americans threatened to do it a few weeks ago, if you notice. And Netanyahu kept pushing and pushing them. And because of the U.S. election, they have not done. But I think after the U.S. election, you'll see the U.S. come in with a harder line. And I'll add one more wild card for people to watch. The first time that Israel kills a UN peacekeeper, and they have been hitting those UN peacekeeper sites. And I say this with an interest here because we've got 370 Irish troops who are out there as part of the force. First time they kill a UN peacekeeper, that raises the stakes immensely in terms of what the international community does about this.
Well, I mean, normally I would take a very cynical stance with regard to the United Nations and its importance. But I mean, I would like to think that we would actually care for those people in the blue helmets enough to actually make us think about that if that were to happen. So let's wait and see. So with Israeli airstrikes becoming more frequent in Syria, how has the Assad regime responded, and what are the potential consequences for the stability of Syria in all of this mess?
The Assad regime is just simply keeping its head down. I mean, the regime media every day will talk about the valiant Palestinian resistance, specifically Hamas's resistance. They'll talk about the number of Israeli casualties that take place if they happen. They praise the Iranian ballistic missile strikes, but the Assad regime is going to do very little beyond that. First of all, because the Assad regime's military is severely hindered, crippled by more than a decade of trying to kill their own people. They are dependent upon Russia and Iran economically, militarily. At the same time, Israel will regularly come in and hit Assad regime, Iranian positions, Hezbollah positions in Syria, in part to let the regime know they can do that. Assad just wants to stay in power. So the more that he stays off to the side here, that's going to be his interest. And again, that just adds an element to the fact that if Iran was to go directly after Israel, the Assad regime can contribute very little. It's not like they can charge in through the Golan Heights where Israel occupies and liberate those immediately.
Just by the way, do you know how many Hezbollah fighters are still operating in Syria? They've been in Syria supporting the Assad regime for quite some time, but now that everything has gone pear-shaped in Lebanon, has there been a wholesale sort of swap over in terms of, all these battle-hardened Hezbollah people are coming back to southern Lebanon, or are they hanging around trying to protect Assad and Iran's interests more broadly in Syria?
Yeah, we don't have a number. I'd be interested to find out a number, and I'll double check after this interview. But my sense is that most of Hezbollah's people have gone back into Lebanon. That you had the Iranians who have their commanders in there who oversee the operations around the Assad regime. But by and large, once Syria hits that partition, and it is partitioned, by the way. I mean, you have the Assad regime area, you have Kurdistan in the northeast. You have the anti-Assad opposition area in the northwest. Once that happened and you have that uneasy partition that takes place, Hezbollah can then concentrate back on Lebanon. Now, that being said, you probably have Hezbollah people in that particular pocket of Syria that borders, of course, the Golan Heights, where the Israelis are, and borders Lebanon as well. So if you talk around that southwest area of Syria, there'll be a Hezbollah presence there, but it'll be a much more focused presence. Rather than being one across the country.
I'm John Rooney, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. From Ireland, we're speaking with journalist and emeritus professor at the University of Birmingham, Scott Lucas. Scott, we have a little thing about what we were talking about in February. You said in February that it was the actions of Hamas on October 7th that started this new cycle of violence in the Middle East. Do you still maintain this view? I mean, considering the longevity of the struggles that were going backwards and forwards, I mean, was October 7th the break in continuity that it was made out to be?
Yeah. First of all, shout out to where I am now, which is professor of U.S. international politics at University College Dublin. I just say that because the Clinton Institute, where I am, is just a fantastic place to work with us. So,
okay,
giving them the shout out. Let's get to that important question that you've asked. Look, the cycles of violence which have taken place in the Middle East go back even before the creation of the State of Israel. They go back during the British colonial period. We could talk about it, the French colonial period. And we could talk about the various wars that have taken place, the Arab-Israeli war since 48, as well as civil wars, insurgencies within countries. Absolutely take that on board. But I think why I say that the October the 7th attack by Hamas was a catalyst in terms of the cycle of violence is if you actually look at the position that the Netanyahu government was taking, and this might sound really strange given where we are now, Netanyahu, in a way, was happy to not just to live with Hamas, but almost in a sense to build up Hamas, because Netanyahu's concern was he was going to be balanced into a two-state resolution with Palestine, and by Palestine, I mean more the Palestinian Authority over in the West Bank. And of course, Hamas is a rival of the Palestinian Authority. And so after the 2021 skirmish, in which the Israelis gave Hamas a bit of a bloody nose, it was like, well, we've made our point here. And while the Israelis maintained the blockade on Gaza, they did allow more economic aid and more goods to get into the strip. Now, Hamas, of course, read this very differently. Hamas actually, because of 2021, that's why Mohammed Daif begins planning what will become October 7th. But there's an Israeli intelligence failure there. Because of the political approach they're taking, they don't perceive this is going to happen. And that means that Hamas completely changes the equation on October 7th, because Israel's going to have to respond to that. I mean, Israel's going to have to respond when you have around 1,200 people killed, the majority of them being civilians, 251 hostages, the large majority of them being civilians. Israel's going to respond. Now, the question was going to be how they responded. And the international community is telling the Israelis, we'll guarantee your security, but you need to move politically and economically. That's where you need to move against Hamas, because you need to split the civilian population from Hamas. You need to try to isolate them. So that's, I'm not doing this as a both sides treatment to play fence sitting, but I'm saying you can look at Hamas, you can say in a way that they were willing to use Gaza's civilians as pawns, because they were going to carry out an attack that was going to invite retaliation. They were going to hope they would survive that retaliation, while civilians wouldn't. And at the same time, the Netanyahu government is willing to use Gaza civilians as pawns and to kill them as pawns, because they want to make the demonstration that they will destroy Hamas. And so, both sides, Hamas and the Israeli leadership, make their calculations knowing full well that the largest share of casualties will be amongst the innocent. And they're happy to continue doing that in perpetuity at this point.
Could Netanyahu or any other Israeli prime minister have run a less violent and more nuanced response to October 7, or was the orgy of vengeance we've been witness to always likely to have happened?
Of course, they could have done something different. Now, you can argue whether or not it would have been effective. You can argue whether or not it would have been, whether it would have turned out in, quote, positive. But of course, they could have done something different. They could have gone for a longer range tactic here, which would have been, all right, we've got to look at getting Hamas out of Gaza in the sense of being the governing authority. We've got to get Hamas out of there as the leading military force. We're going to work with allies to do that. They could have done that at the same time that they would have provided assistance to Gaza civilians through the UN and through others to give distance between civilians and Hamas. Once you attack Hamas directly, and once you kill those civilians, whether or not those civilians like Hamas, you make those civilians dependent on Hamas. They have got nowhere else they can go to, especially when almost 2 million of them are going to be displaced. And, I don't know, again, if the Israelis in gaming this out knew that was what would happen, but I think they did. I think at least Netanyahu did. Yeah. And that's why I said that, the civilians were expendable. Where the calculation runs into problems Oh, sorry, let me back this up. You could make the argument that not going after Hamas with that overwhelming show of force meant that you're not going to get the hostages back immediately. You can make the argument that it does not remove Hamas as a security threat immediately. You can make the argument that it doesn't resolve the political situation immediately. I take all those points on board. It would take time to get this isolation of Hamas to occur. It would take time to bolster other Palestinian groups to make sure that they don't support Hamas and that they could be part of the solution in Gaza. It would take time. But where are we right now? It has taken time to, quote, attempt to destroy Hamas. And in the meantime, you have offered nothing for the civilians of Gaza. You have destroyed the Strip. It will take years to rebuild it. And you have probably ensured the survival, if not of Hamas, of other groups that will be bent on Israel's destruction because they will be looking for revenge, they will be angry, and they will see no hope in living side by side with Israel. And that was the choice that was made, that Netanyahu made.
You know, honey is more attractive than other substances when it comes to attracting flies.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I just don't understand why, you know, something that was a little bit more long term in the view of actually bringing the temperature of everything down rather than amping it up and using the military stick constantly is the way that you try to push ahead with a particular agenda. I mean, but I suppose in many ways that's a sort of Middle Eastern cultural phenomenon. When it comes to face-saving measures, when it comes to all these kind of things where your macho-minded
Yeah.
policy leaders are moving forward, they want to not appear weak, they want to appear strong, and so they'll brandish the AK-47 or the Armalite and go for it, you know, because that's what gives them their power, I suppose. So, Scott, there was more than a little controversy regarding recent comments by Vice President Kamala Harris, Democratic nominee for the 2024 US presidential election, when she apparently said that genocide in Gaza was real. Her minders quickly walked that one back. How difficult is it for a progressive American leader to be more mindful of their words during a time of war abroad, especially when it comes to being critical of Israel?
Look, when you talk about the U.S. political culture, if you're on the Democrat side, or if let's not say progressive, you walk a tightrope that's there. Being said, you're going to have a lot of American political culture, which is going to be supportive of Israel, whatever happens. And then you will have an element of American society, an element which is growing, has been galvanized by what has happened in the past year, which is going to say, why aren't you criticizing Israel? Why are you not coming out in defense of Palestine civilians? For Biden, at the end of the day, Joe Biden, who is pretty sympathetic to Israel, if not Netanyahu, was going to stay his course in terms of Israel security. Israel security was going to be paramount. What Harris has done, even before she became the presidential nominee, she was doing it since the spring, was to give herself a bit of distance by saying Gaza civilians should be a priority, and that is where she was going with when she said that genocide was taking place. But as you put it right, she had overstepped the mark. You cannot use genocide, the G word, in American political culture to refer to what is happening. And it means from a political point of view that somewhat vague approach amongst what you might call centrist Democrats is going to continue, even as progressives put for more action. The open question here is if Harris gets elected, we talk about what happened if Trump gets elected, it's been chaos. If Harris gets elected, does she actually shift to what is not just the progressive position, it's the flaming humanitarian position, which is to actually say, no, enough is enough here, and to really put pressure on the Israelis. And that I can't tell you. I mean, I can't tell you, and I wouldn't bother to predict. A lot of people saying Harris will be just like Biden. They're not going to be a change. I'm just saying she's given herself the rhetorical space to make the shift if she cared to do so. But that shift, again, I have to emphasize, isn't going to take place before the U.S. election. Indeed, I don't think it wouldn't take place until she took office, which, of course, is not till January. So we're stuck in a U.S. where it's a rhetorical tightrope. And in the meantime, the very real reality of more and more people getting killed each day is going to continue for at least the next, 4 months.
Okay, Scott, last question, or last two questions.
Mhm.
What do you think the end game is for Gaza? And are we looking at the possible reintroduction of Jewish settlements and a permanent division of Palestinian land like the West Bank?
There are only two end games for Gaza. Um, you either have an end game in which the entire strip is rendered unfit for humanity, where almost all of its buildings are leveled, where all of its services are damaged, maybe destroyed, where the large majority of its population are displaced. In other words, Gaza becomes a giant refugee camp for Gazans. You know, their own country gets turned into that. Or you have a Gaza which becomes part of a resolution where you, and it will take time, it becomes an area as part of Palestine, which has a government, which has the ability to run an economy, which has services, which has schools, which has hospitals, which works with the international system, one which is secured by the international system at the same time that Israel's security is guaranteed by that international system. Those are only two options you have. If you take that in between, which is an Israeli occupation, that's not an end game. That's not an end game of the West Bank. And I know it's been going on for 57 years, but it's still not an end game in the West Bank. And it would not be an end game in Gaza as well. Benjamin Netanyahu knows, however, he's not going to live for another 57 years. So he doesn't give a damn about the end game.
Yeah.
Well, you never know, well, I'm not going to say what I was thinking at that point about, those who shall not be named, and how they survive. Netanyahu doesn't care. Netanyahu doesn't care about the end game for Gaza. But there may be some Israelis, not just the Israelis who come out and are questioning what is happening, who are there on the streets, but those who are within the system who think, is this really what we want? So I'm going to refer you to a couple of statements. So I'll just leave them hanging there. Benny Gantz, near the start of the Israeli intervention in Hamas. Now, Benny Gantz is the opposition leader. He's former head of the Israeli Defense Forces, and he was part of the war cabinet. He let it be known that he wanted to know what the end game was. And Benny Gantz asked that question for months until he finally resigned from the war cabinet in May. Yoav Gallant, privately, as we mentioned earlier, was saying, up until the attacks on Lebanon, there is no end game here. Netanyahu can't answer that question. Again, it doesn't matter to him, but it may matter to those folks. And that was the international community's play. That was the American play, was to cultivate those people to finally say, you need to pull back from this. Probably the answer to this is still within Israel. It's made more difficult because of Lebanon for the moment, but the answer here is still within Israel. You've got to get to those Israelis who want to know what the end game is. And you've got to get to those Palestinians who want to know, how is there a way out of this where we're not trapped, stateless, deprived, at risk of death. And you've got to work with both sides to do that. Which means the easy part for me is to denounce Netanyahu or denounce the late Yahya Sinwar. That's the easy part. The hard part is getting beyond Netanyahu, getting beyond Sinwar, getting beyond Nasrallah, to try to say, look, where can you get a humane and functioning solution so that these states can live side by side?
Oh, Scott, blessed are the peacekeepers. I don't know where they are. I think they must be out with the aliens somewhere, but they're not on this planet. Scott Lucas, thanks for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you, John. Stay safe, stay sane.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Scott Lucas. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Scott and connect with him on social media. Now on to questions for the audience. With Israel and Iran now openly trading strikes, do we think that we're on the brink of a larger regional war, or will diplomatic channels eventually cool tensions? Hezbollah and Israel have been at odds for decades. Do you believe Hezbollah's involvement in southern Lebanon could trigger a full-scale war, or is this this just another flare-up in a long-standing conflict? How do you see the role of foreign powers like Russia and Iran shaping the future of Syria? Can Israel continue its military campaign without broader international repercussions? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have any comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.